Leo stood on the stage, the heavy polyester of his graduation gown clinging to his skin in the humid afternoon air. Around him, the roar of the crowd was a muffled ocean, punctuated by the rhythmic, collective breathing of thousands of hopeful souls. He looked out at the sea of mortarboards and felt a singular heavy weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the diploma in his hand. Beside him, his father's eyes were shining with a triumph that felt more like a victory for the past than a celebration of the future. "This is it, Leo," his father had whispered earlier, patting the pocket where the printed offer letter sat like a holy relic. "The golden ticket, a junior analyst position at the city's top firm. You finally made it." To Leo, it felt like the closing of a door. He was a brilliant, creative mind being handed over to a machine that valued conformity over curiosity. The skyscraper loomed over the city like a jagged glass needle, piercing the low-hanging clouds of a gray Monday morning. As Leo stepped through the revolving doors, the air changed instantly. It was cold, sterile, and smelled of expensive floor wax and recycled oxygen. His vibrant personality, usually expressed through innovative code and sharp artistic vision, felt muted beneath the stiff, itchy collar of his new navy blue suit. He followed a silent guide through a labyrinth of identical hallways until they reached a vast, open-plan floor. This was his new reality, a sprawling sea of gray cubicles stretching toward the horizon. There were no windows in his section, only the relentless, artificial hum of fluorescent lights that flickered at a frequency just high enough to induce a dull, persistent headache by noon. The first week was a slow-motion collision with reality. Leo had been told during the interview process that his role was impactful and dynamic. Instead, he found himself tethered to 2 monitors for 10 hours a day, his life reduced to the rhythmic clicking of a mouse and the endless formatting of complex spreadsheets. The tiny rectangular cells on the screen became his entire world. He spent hours ensuring that margins were perfectly aligned and that the specific shade of blue used for the headers matched the corporate branding precisely. It was a digital assembly line, a soul-crushing repetition that made his creative brain itch with a deep, restless frustration. He felt like a thoroughbred horse being used to pull a rusted plow, wasting his brilliance on tasks that required no soul. During his brief lunch breaks, Leo observed his senior colleagues. They moved through the office with a heavy, practiced exhaustion, their backs slightly hunched from years of staring at the same glowing screens. In the break room, the air was always thick with a pervasive, quiet cynicism. They talked about mortgage rates, their children's tuition, and most frequently exactly how many years they had left until they could finally afford to retire. To them, the firm was a survival mechanism, a place where they traded their vitality for a sense of stability that looked increasingly like a slow-motion surrender. Leo saw his own future reflected in their tired, gray eyes and felt a cold shiver of dread. Is this it? He wondered. Do I just wait 40 years for my turn to stop coming here? The realization of the corporate structure's true nature came during his second month. Leo had stayed late for 3 consecutive nights, developing a streamlined algorithm that could automate a data entry task that usually took his entire team 20 hours a week to complete. He proudly presented it to a senior manager, a man with a fixed plastic smile and a wardrobe of characterless suits. The manager's eyes had briefly flickered with interest, but his only comment was a curt, "I'll look into it." 2 days later, during a department-wide meeting, Leo watched in stunned silence as the senior manager presented the algorithm as his own strategic innovation. He received a round of applause from the executives while Leo looked at his hands, realizing that in this world, loyalty was a one-way street. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Later that evening, as the elevator descended from the high-altitude silence of the office to the noise of the street, Leo's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a notification from a former classmate, a guy who had dropped out of his final semester to focus on a niche digital project. The post showed a screenshot of a dashboard on a decentralized digital platform. It wasn't a brag, it was a simple confirmation of a payout. In one single month, his peer had earned what Leo's starting salary paid for an entire year of labor. The message attached was simple: "The system is broken. Leo, stop playing by their rules." As Leo walked toward the subway, the city lights reflecting off the cold glass of the skyscraper behind him, a dangerous electric thought took root in his mind. Why am I here? The golden ticket in his pocket suddenly felt like a heavy piece of lead. The dread didn't wait for Monday morning anymore. It began to settle in on Sunday afternoon, a cold, oily slick of anxiety that pooled in the pit of Leo's stomach as the sun dipped below the city skyline. The Sunday scaries had mutated into a chronic weekday malaise that followed him like a shadow. shadow. Every morning, the sound of his alarm felt like a physical blow against his ribs. His skin looked sallow under the relentless office fluorescence. And the creative spark that used to ignite his eyes had been replaced by a dull, flickering exhaustion. He wasn't just tired, he was mourning the person he used to be before the spreadsheets took over. His health was a secondary concern to the firm, a mere variable in a productivity equation that never seemed to balance in his favor. He felt his youth leaking out of him, one cell at a time, into the sterile vacuum of the office air. Driven by a desperate need for a middle ground, Leo finally sought an audience with Mr. Sterling. The office of the department head was a shrine to old-world corporate power, filled with heavy dark wood and the suffocating scent of leather-bound books that no one ever actually read. Leo proposed a modest shift, a hybrid schedule or flexible hours that would allow him to work during his peak creative windows and reclaim some of his mental clarity. Mr. Sterling didn't even look up from his mahogany desk for the first 30 seconds. When he finally did, his gaze was a mix of pity and sharp disdain. He leaned back, his expensive chair creaking under the weight of his rigid worldview. He spoke of paying one's dues and the sanctity of the office, ultimately dismissing Leo's request with a sharp, dismissive bark of a laugh. To Mr. Sterling, Gen Z's desire for balance was simply a lack of character, a symptom of an entitled, lazy generation that didn't understand the honor of the grind. Returning to his cubicle, Leo felt a strange shift in his perception. He began to see the office not as a collective of professionals, but as a silent battlefield. He noticed Maya, 3 rows over, staring at a static screen for 20 minutes while her fingers danced across her phone hidden beneath the desk. He saw Marcus, a veteran of 15 years, doing exactly what was required. Nothing more, nothing less, with the mechanical precision of a ghost. This was the hidden revolution, quiet quitting. His coworkers weren't lazy. They were protecting what little energy they had left from a system that took everything and gave back nothing but a paycheck and a headache. They were building secret lives in the margins of their billable hours, whispering about side hustles and freelance gigs during hushed smoke breaks near the service elevator. Lunch breaks became Leo's sanctuary of subversion. While his colleagues complained about the cafeteria's bland pasta, Leo was miles away, mentally navigating the vast, shimmering landscapes of the creator economy. He spent those 60 minutes huddled over his phone, his thumb flying through articles on solopreneurship, decentralized finance, and the rising tide of the passion economy. He realized that the tools for his liberation were already resting in the palm of his hand. The same high-speed internet that allowed his firm to track his every keystroke was also a gateway to a world where his skills were valued by their actual output, not by the number of hours he sat in an ergonomic chair. He saw teenagers building empires from their bedrooms, and developers creating micro-SaaS products that solved real problems. The contrast between that vibrant, meritocratic world and the stagnant, recirculated air of the skyscraper was becoming unbearable. When he finally returned home each night, the navy blue suit was cast aside like a heavy suit of armor. In the quiet sanctity of his apartment, fueled by double-shot espressos and a desperate hunger for autonomy, Leo's secret project began to take shape. He was building a platform, a digital bridge for independent creators to monetize their skills without the need for corporate gatekeepers. It was more than a side hustle, it was a lifeline. While the city slept, Leo's screen glowed with lines of code that felt like poetry. He was working harder than he ever had at the firm, but this labor didn't feel like a drain. It felt like an investment in a future he actually wanted to inhabit. The boundaries between his two lives began to blur, his mind constantly drifting toward his own creation even as he sat through Mr. Sterling's interminable morning briefings about synergy and quarterly targets. The traction was sudden and terrifyingly real. A small community of beta users began to grow, and for the first time, Leo saw his ideas making a tangible impact on people's lives. He felt a rush of adrenaline that no corporate bonus could ever provide. However, this double life came with a steep price. His focus at the firm began to fray like an old rope under too much tension. Spreadsheets remained unformatted, emails went unanswered for days, and the once perfect margins of his reports began to drift. He was physically present, but his spirit had already moved out of the building. The senior manager who had stolen his algorithm noticed the change, his eyes narrowing as he watched Leo's declining metrics with a predatory satisfaction. One rainy Thursday afternoon, the inevitable happened. A calendar invitation popped up on Leo's screen, a stark white notification that stood out against the gray background of his desktop. It wasn't a project update or a team sync. It was an invitation to a closed-door meeting in the Human Resources wing. The subject line was chillingly vague: performance and alignment review. As Leo stood up, he felt the eyes of the quiet quitters on his back, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that was about to break. He walked toward the glass-walled offices of HR, the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the hollow hallway, knowing that the fragile balance of his double life was about to shatter. The HR office was a vacuum of human emotion, a space where the air seemed to have been scrubbed of everything except the scent of expensive toner and forced neutrality. Two representatives, their faces masks of professional concern, sat across from Leo. They didn't see a brilliant young mind, they saw a malfunctioning cog. They laid out a series of printouts documenting his lack of engagement, missed deadlines, a wandering focus, and a general aura of detachment that had begun to infect his department. The language was clinical, referring to his creative spark as a variable of non-alignment, and they were clear: his side projects were no longer considered a hobby, they were a conflict of interest. Leo was given a choice that felt more like a sentence: purge his external interests and commit fully to the firm's vision, or accept a severance package that wouldn't even cover 2 months of rent. It was an ultimatum designed to break his spirit. The weight of that choice followed him to his parents' home for dinner that weekend. The atmosphere was thick with the aroma of roast chicken and the unspoken expectations of a previous generation. His father, a man whose identity was forged in the fires of a 40-year tenure at a single company, spoke of stability as if it were a physical deity. His mother recounted the sacrifices they had made to ensure Leo could have the golden ticket. When Leo tried to explain the soul-crushing monotony of his daily life, the dismissive scoff from his father cut deeper than any reprimand from Mr. Sterling. To them, his desire for autonomy was a mark of privilege and ingratitude. They viewed his potential resignation as a public shame. Leo sat in silence, realizing that the people who loved him most were also the ones most invested in keeping him in a cage. The final push came on a Tuesday morning that began with an eerie, forced quiet. A company-wide invitation for a strategic update appeared on every monitor. There was no meeting room, only a 15-minute Zoom call where a faceless executive read a statement. In those moments, hundreds of employees, including veterans who had built their lives around the firm's promises, were summarily terminated. The digital guillotine fell without warning. Leo watched as men in their 50s were suddenly locked out of their emails and escorted to the elevators by security guards. The loyalty that HR had demanded from Leo was revealed to be a one-way street leading toward a cliff. In the cold light of that betrayal, a realization hit him. Stability was a myth created to keep the gears turning. The only real security in a world that could erase your existence with a keystroke was the ability to rely on oneself. He retreated into the digital shadows, finding solace in an online tribe of Gen Z entrepreneurs who had already walked away. This secret community, connected through encrypted channels, provided the mentorship and honesty that the corporate hierarchy suppressed. They shared stories of failure and success, traded strategies for independence, and validated the feeling that the world had changed even if the architects of the skyscraper hadn't noticed. Leo felt his resolve harden like tempered steel. He spent the evening preparing his exit strategy, his fingers flying across the keys with a renewed purpose. He was ready to leave the glass tower behind and bet everything on the platform he had built in the quiet hours of the night. But as he logged into his server to finalize the latest deployment, his blood turned to ice. A red banner pulsed at the top of his screen, indicating a catastrophic system failure. A digital glitch was systematically corrupting his database. His users were being logged out, his code was dissolving into gibberish, and months of labor were vanishing. Just as he was about to step off the ledge of corporate security, the safety net he had spent his life building was being shredded by a ghost in the machine. The blue light of the monitor felt like a cold interrogation lamp, as the lines of code Leo had labored over for months continued to dissolve into meaningless hexadecimal nonsense. The red banner at the top of his screen was a heartbeat, pulsing with the relentless rhythm of his own rising panic. Every frantic refresh brought more error messages, more broken links, and the gut-wrenching realization that his digital escape route was crumbling. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, the silence of his small apartment felt deafening. The ghost of Mr. Sterling's voice echoed in his mind, a cynical whisper suggesting he was exactly what the firm said, an amateur playing at being a professional. He actually reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his former boss. A single apology, a promise of focus, and the predictable comfort of the glass tower would be his again. He could almost smell the sterile air of the lobby, but as his thumb hovered, a surge of defiant energy replaced the fear. This was the exact moment the old world expected him to fold. Instead, Leo leaned into the digital fluency that the corporate world misunderstood. He didn't just try to patch the code. He tore it down and rebuilt it using decentralized protocols he had learned from his online tribe. He wasn't just a worker, he was an architect. For 72 grueling hours, time was marked only by shifting shadows and a growing mountain of empty coffee mugs. He pivoted his strategy, adopting a portfolio career model to diversify his financial risk. He began offering high-level consulting to startups while simultaneously stabilizing his micro SaaS product. He was no longer waiting for a monthly paycheck. He was creating value in real time across multiple streams of income. Yet the victory felt hollow in the quiet hours. Solopreneurship stripped away the forced social scaffolding of office life. There were no water cooler chats and no physical presence of other human beings to ground his reality. The isolation began to gnaw at his sanity. He would go 3 days without speaking a word out loud, his only human interactions mediated by Slack notifications and sterile emails. The freedom he had craved felt like a vast, lonely ocean where he was the only sailor. He found himself staring out the window at the morning commuters, a strange pang of envy striking him as he watched them walk in groups toward their shared cages. Was he truly free, or had he simply traded one large prison for a smaller, more solitary one? The emotional weight became unbearable when his phone rang with a call from home. It wasn't a call of support. His father's voice was clipped, a sharp blade of disappointment that cut through the speaker. They had heard through family friends that he hadn't returned to the firm after the mass layoffs. His mother's muffled sobs in the background felt like a physical weight on his chest. To them, his struggle wasn't a noble pursuit. It was a reckless abandonment of responsibility. "You're throwing your future away for a flickering screen," his father spat before the line went dead. The silence that followed was the heaviest he had ever known. He was officially an outcast, standing on a bridge he had burned at both ends. Exhausted and feeling the full weight of failure, Leo did something uncalculated. He turned on his camera. He didn't use filters or a script. He sat in the dim light of his workspace and spoke directly into the lens about the stability myth, parental expectations, and the terrifying loneliness of building something new. He talked about the Sunday scaries and the corporate betrayal he had witnessed. He uploaded the raw, unedited video to a social platform, thinking it might reach a dozen people before disappearing into the digital void. He closed his laptop and fell into a dreamless sleep of exhaustion. He was unaware that the algorithm was already beginning to breathe life into his vulnerability. By the time he woke, the digital world had found its new anthem, a shared voice for a generation that had finally found its courage. It was more than a video, it was a revolution. The notification pings began as a steady trickle before escalating into a relentless digital roar. When Leo finally opened his laptop, the sheer volume of engagement was staggering. His raw, unfiltered confession had punctured a hole in the collective silence of millions. Thousands of messages flooded his inbox, each one a testament to the cubicle rot he had so vividly described. People from every corner of the globe were sharing their own stories of quiet desperation, of years spent trading their vitality for a pension that felt more like a myth than a promise. Leo sat in the dim glow of his screen, reading through testimonies of burnouts, of missed family milestones, and of the profound emptiness that came with being a nameless cog in a massive, indifferent machine. He wasn't just a content creator anymore. He had inadvertently become the lightning rod for a generational storm, a voice for those who felt they had no right to complain about their traditional stability. As the days passed, the nature of the communication shifted from empathy to opportunity. The initial wave of validation from peers was followed by a more calculated interest from the very corporate world he had walked away from. However, the tone was fundamentally different. Brands, venture capitalists, and tech giants weren't reaching out with standard job descriptions or rigid salary tiers. They were seeking his partnership. They wanted the Leo perspective to help them navigate a labor market where the old incentives no longer worked. He found himself in virtual boardrooms, not as a junior analyst taking minutes, but as a founder and a visionary visionary leader. The power dynamic had completely inverted. He was no longer begging for a seat at the table. He was the one being asked to build a new table entirely. The imposter syndrome that had haunted his early days of independence began to dissolve, replaced by the quiet, steady confidence of someone who had found their true north in the digital wilderness. This shift manifested physically on a rainy Tuesday at the coffee shop near his old office. Leo was nursing a cold brew, his mind deep in a product roadmap, when the door chimed and a familiar silhouette stepped in. It was Mr. Sterling. The man looked exactly the same, sharply tailored suit, polished shoes, and an expression of permanent irritation, yet he seemed smaller, somehow diminished by the gray morning light. When their eyes met, there was no scoff or condescending lecture. Instead, Sterling hesitated. He looked at Leo's relaxed posture, his focused energy, and the way he occupied the space without the frantic need to prove his worth. For a brief moment, the corporate mask slipped entirely. Sterling spoke briefly of the constant challenges at the firm, but his voice lacked its former conviction. He complained about the new kids not understanding the traditional grind, yet as he spoke, his gaze kept drifting to Leo's open laptop and the vibrant community thriving on the screen. In that silence, Leo realized a profound truth. Sterling wasn't truly angry at Leo's generation for being entitled. He was envious of the courage they had to demand something better. Sterling was a prisoner who had learned to love his bars, and seeing Leo on the other side was a painful reminder of the life he had traded for a title. Walking away from that encounter, Leo felt a clarity more valuable than any paycheck. The narrative that his generation didn't want to work was a convenient lie. They wanted to work harder than any generation before them, but they refused to do it for nothing more than a cubicle and a gold watch. They wanted work that aligned with their personal values, environments that offered true flexibility, and a system that rewarded merit over the theater of seniority. Success was being redefined before his eyes, not as a climb up a ladder, but as the expansion of one's own sovereignty over time and spirit. The piece was interrupted by an acquisition proposal from a global tech titan. They wanted to buy his project for an amount that would change his life forever. But as he read the fine print, the catch emerged. The deal was contingent on Leo serving as an executive for 3 years. He would be rich, but he would be back in the cage. Leo stared at the digital contract, the blue light reflecting in his eyes like a beckoning siren. The numbers were staggering, a sum that represented the ultimate traditional success. It was the golden ticket he had been told to chase since he first picked up a pencil in kindergarten, a multi-million-dollar buyout that would theoretically set him up for life. But his eyes kept drifting to clause 4, too. Executive commitment, 3 years, 1,095 days of mandatory meetings, corporate hierarchy, and the return of the suffocating tie. He looked around his small, light-filled studio, a space that breathed with his own ideas and the quiet hum of independent servers. If he signed, this sanctuary would vanish, replaced by a corner office with a glass wall that didn't open. He realized the price of the millions was his soul. With a steady hand, he typed a brief refusal. He wasn't selling his freedom back to the system he had escaped. The feeling that followed wasn't regret. It was the purest form of power. The power to say no to a fortune in exchange for his sovereignty. A few days later, Leo sat in his parents' living room. The air was usually thick with unspoken disappointment, but today, something had shifted. He didn't show them his bank balance. Instead, he showed them a video of a community project he had funded, a group of young creators building a sustainable vertical farm. He talked about the lives changed and the autonomy granted. For the first time, his father didn't talk about the pension or the dental plan. He looked at his son and saw a man who wasn't exhausted by his labor, but energized by it. "I thought safety was a cage that didn't shake," his father admitted quietly, his voice cracking with a rare vulnerability. "I didn't realize that the cage itself was the danger." The silence that followed was no longer a chasm, it was a bridge. His parents finally understood that Leo wasn't running away from work, he was running toward a life that mattered. This wasn't just Leo's story. Across the globe, a silent tectonic shift was rearranging the landscape of human effort. In the mountains, a former developer was coding from a solar-powered cabin, trading his high-rise view for a canopy of green. In quiet suburbs, Gen Z innovators were bypassing traditional structures to build microeconomies that favored human connection over the cold efficiency of the stock market. Some were homesteading, others were digital nomads, but all were united by a refusal to be a cog in an indifferent machine. The Great Resignation was a misnomer coined by those who couldn't see past the office door. It was, in truth, the Great Realization. A generation had looked at the script written by their ancestors, the one that promised happiness after 40 years of toil toil, and decided to rewrite the ending while they still had the strength to enjoy the journey. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden fingers across the warm sand. Leo sat with his back against a piece of driftwood, his laptop resting on his knees. He wasn't on a holiday. He was simply existing in a world where the boundary between work and life had dissolved into a seamless, beautiful whole. He spent 2 hours finishing a strategy for a peer-to-peer education network, his mind sharp and clear, fueled by the salt air and the rhythmic pulse of the waves. He looked at the screen, then at the vast ocean, and realized he was finally a sovereign citizen of his own time. The world of Mr. Sterling, with its gray cubicles and silent elevators, felt like a distant memory of a dream he had finally woken up from. He slowly closed the laptop, the soft white light of the first stars beginning to replace the glow of the screen. He was no longer waiting for the weekend. He was living the life he had once been told was impossible. Are you working to live, or just waiting to die?